My name is Olivia Bird, and this year I've been studying microscopy and image analysis for electrodes for energy conversion and storage. For this particular presentation, I'm going to talk about my work doing roughness analysis on fuel cell catalyst layers. I'd like to thank my mentors, Sarah Zakarin, as well as Dr. Svetlana Pilapenko. Briefly, I'd like to just talk about what fuel cells are, and specifically the polymer electrolyte membrane, or PM fuel cell, which is what we were using for this project. A PM fuel cell produces electrical power from stored chemical energy. Generally, this energy is in the form of hydrogen. This is done via a redox reaction, which requires a catalyst at the electrode surface, which is what we're going to be studying. Fuel cells are of interest to a lot of sectors, particularly the transportation sector, due to their high efficiency and low carbon emissions. The catalyst is prepared by mixing the platinum catalyst on a carbon support with ionomer and a water alcohol solvent. We call this the ink, and then the ink is mixed for some amount of time, usually a few days, before being applied to the electrode surface using the roll-on coating method. And for this project, we plan to study surface morphology, specifically roughness, which the rougher the catalyst is, the more surface area and thus activity it has. So roughness is good, as well as cracking, which is generally bad because it can reduce performance. Various fabrication parameters can affect these characteristics and thus the performance. And for this study, we plan to look specifically how the mixing time of the ink affects the performance. So the first thing I did was gathered SEM, or skinning electron microscopy data, at 200x and 1000x magnifications. Once I had these SEM images, I was able to do all sorts of things, create roughness maps at various scales, macro and micro, create 3D visualizations of the roughness from our 2D images, and obviously look at how things change over time, specifically the time that the ink was mixed, which is the thing that we really care about. So shown here is the graph of the average roughness at 24, 48, 72, and 96-hour mixing times. Each data point was collected by having 3 samples at 2 magnifications. The most representative of the low magnification regions is shown above. And we can see that there's a general trend of increasing roughness with increasing time, other than one kind of funky data point of the 96-hour low magnification. However, we weren't 100% sure how much of this roughness increase was true roughness, because even visually, it's really clear that the 96 and 72-hour samples have significantly more cracks in them than the lower mixing time samples. And we want to make sure that the roughness of the actual layer is increasing, because that's the important thing that gives us surface area and thus catalytic activity. If the only reason it's increasing is because it's getting more cracked, because cracks also are a form of roughness, that's not particularly helpful to us. And obviously something we need to know, because we would actually prefer less cracks for ideal performance. So I wanted to develop a method to be able to analyze the roughness without any cracks in it. The first thing I did is shown on the left. I simply just wanted to crop out to a smaller region of the layer without any cracks in it. This worked okay. It gave us data roughly similar to what we saw before, which means that maybe the cracks didn't affect the roughness too much. But I also didn't completely trust this data, because it's only giving us such a small sample area, and we really would prefer to see what's going on in the entire catalyst layer, not just a tiny little cropped square. So I then developed the algorithm shown on the right in the majority of the slide. I used a machine learning algorithm, specifically Weka segmentation in the program ImageJ, to identify cracks and not cracks, essentially, and then just create a binary image of everything that's a crack and everything that isn't a crack. With this, there are two things I was able to do. First of all, I was able to just plug this into a computer and say, count up how much of it is dark gray, how much of the image is light gray. And by doing that, I was able to figure out exactly what percent of my image was dominated by cracks. So was there really a big jump in cracks around, 72 to 96 hours? Because it sure looked to me like cracking was increasing. The other thing I was able to do is create what's called a mask, which essentially, by applying the mask to the regular image, we can get our initial image back, but everything that used to be a crack is now transparent. So our algorithm won't read any of the areas that were identified by the Weka segmentation algorithm as cracks. This is what really allowed me to analyze the true roughness without any cracks in there and without just cropping to a small non-representative area. So here's what our results look like. In each section, from left to right, we have the low magnification image, the high magnification image, the low magnification image cropped to an area without cracks, high magnification cropped to an area without cracks, and then the low magnification using the masking algorithm shown before. Overall, we see that the methods are roughly comparable. We get similar trends of increasing roughness over time, particularly a big jump between 48 and 72 hours. We did see that there seemed to be higher roughness in the higher magnification samples. This might just be because they were looking at a smaller area and thus zoomed in more. It's also possible that the way the algorithm was counting roughness, a big bump or crack that's 5 times larger is going to look rougher than in the lower magnification image, even though it's the same crack. For the next couple slides of data we're going to look at, the data with the mask was used because we decided that it was the most representative, as it included the highest amount of catalyst while also removing the cracks. So the first thing I wanted to find out was, how is this roughness changing? What is the nature of it? As opposed to just knowing that the roughness was increasing. For this, I used a measure called skewness, which essentially measures how much of the roughness is peaks and particles and bumps above the baseline surface and how much of it is valleys and cracks. And we can see a very clear trend that our roughness was initially dominated very much by peaks and particles, but that as the roughness increased, remember roughness was increasing, the type of roughness was actually becoming more valley-like. So this tells us that as we increase mixing time, the roughness was increasing specifically because of valleys and microcracks. Again, it should be noted that this was the masked data, so any large cracks were already removed. This trend still occurs even after that and is showing like microcracking and valleys that are too small and not deep enough to be filtered out, which is exactly what we wanted to know and really gives us a good idea of like the nature of the roughness. We also, as I mentioned before, looked at the cracking. So we see a very gradual increase in cracking for the first 72 hours with a huge spike at 96 hours. So that seems to be about how long we can mix the ink before it really starts to degrade and crack, which is super useful information because we want our roughness as high as possible, which based on our previous data would imply that the 96-hour would be great. But all these cracks really reduce performance in a way that we do not want. So our overall conclusions, we found that the ideal mixing time for the catalyst was 48 to 72 hours, probably closer to the 72-hour mark, because that gets us as much roughness as possible, thus as much surface area, and thus catalytic activity. But we still keep the cracking to a relative minimum because we haven't had that huge 96-hour spike. And this hypothesis has been confirmed by actually, testing out the catalysts and electrodes. Additionally, and perhaps more importantly, the methodology that we developed to analyze roughness over mixing time can also be used in the future and will be used to examine other fabrication parameters, such as having different ratios of catalyst, solvent, ionomer, etc., in the ink itself, or different types of carbon supports, or a different method of applying ink to the surface. We can, now that I developed these methods, we can go back and apply them to all these other parameters. I would like to acknowledge Dr. Svetlana Pylypenko, my mentor of 4 years, as well as the entire Pylypenko research group, particularly Sarah Zakarin, who I worked with this year, and Natalie Seitzman, who I've worked with in previous semesters. I'd also like to acknowledge our collaborators at NREL and UConn, who were also part of this project, as well as our funding, my personal funding from the Mines Undergraduate Research Fellowship, and project funding from NSF and the Colorado Energy Research Collaboratory. Thank you for your time.